Let's take just a well, actually, let me just pause for a second and introduce myself. My name is Jerry Nixon. I live here in Colorado. And as a matter of fact, Dave and I were just talking about Denver Dev Day. It's coming up in Colorado. So if you're in Colorado, denverdevday.com is in October. You can enjoy that. Um, but I work at Microsoft. I am an engineer. Actually, I just transitioned onto the SQL server team. And I used to be in commercial software engineering. And I want to talk a little bit about. I'm also a professor, by the way, and I teach C Sharp at a university here in Colorado Christian University, and it is a treat, right, to really be able to kind of teach things in a way that make it well pretty well aligned with a conference like this. And let me start by just thinking about what code quality is, and probably my favorite thing to do in life. I don't know if you know me at all, you know that I just love words. And so let's talk about just words for a moment. And so let's talk about things like best practice. So a lot of people will really, you naturally are attracted to best practices. However, the problem is the idea of a best practice is a little bit troubling, right? Because what does it mean really best? And who decides that it's the best practice? There are many practices and many ways to do the same thing. And one of the heartaches of being a developer is honestly that there are so many options to do the same thing. There are times when I wish we could just have prescriptive guidance that this is the way you're supposed to do it. But the truth is, there are many ways to do it and a lot of variables, and the it depends answer is really true. That's the reason when people say, oh, this is a best practice, you need to raise your eyebrows and kind of be skeptical because the idea of a best practice means it worked really well for them, or maybe it worked for them in the past. And things have changed, and you need to reevaluate to make sure that it's still at least a good practice. I think good practice is probably a much more respectful term than best practice. Best practice really skips over a lot of the details. And now let's talk for a second about code quality. And I don't mean code quality in the sense of this conference. I want to talk about code quality in the sense of how can we break apart code quality into its constituent parts, and then how can we address those programmatically and automatically. So let's start with the kind of categories of code quality um, that we deal with in a most practical sense. So the first is around design, and not UI design, but really a well architected library. And we have a family of rules that go into that to help us know whether or not the code quality in the design category is high or low, right? That's really good. That's what you want. And there's so many. Look how many more we have. Whether or not it's a well documented library, that alone can determine whether or not the quality is high. Whether or not it's globalized, right? Globalization is serious. It determines whether or not your library is ready for the world, ready for every other type of developer out there other than just you. Now, remember, we're talking about libraries here, so we're not talking about the UI. So we're not talking about globalization as far as necessarily language changes and localization, but we are talking about things like handling dates and things along those lines. That can be very important. The idea of portability, this is probably top of mind in the modern world. Portability really is around whether or not it can go to multiple platforms. So you write it on Windows, that's terrific. Have you made it so it can't run on Linux? So are you going to have issues depending on how you deploy this into containers and things like that? Maintainability is all around complexity. So it's another category of code quality. A complex library isn't wrong. An overly complex library is something we need to address. So we have automated rules that allow us to go in and just measure that so that you can make the determination of where that level really needs to be, and you can keep an eye on it if it starts to grow or drops off suddenly. We have, of course, it seems easy just to start with naming conventions, naming, and how we case things where they are in scope and things like that can be very valuable to the developer. They mean nothing to the end user, of course, but they can also be valuable to the developer who's consuming your library as well, and the consistency across projects. And then finally, or not finally, but reliability, right? Because we're going to deal with things that are sophisticated, including things like memory management and thread management. That's going to be important in our library. So we have rules around that. Each one of these are different categories. Each one will have their own rating. Each one will be important to you at a different level depending on the type of library. Then we have security, which is always an issue. I put it at the bottom because it's the most important. And then finally, we have best practices. So it's kind of a miscellaneous set of rules that allow us just to look at, and here we are using best practices, but the recommendations from the team themselves on usage in .NET and problems that they see develop, just common developers. Because remember, you may have experience with, one, two, three, a dozen, even 100 developers, but the .NET team, we have experience with all the developers. So we start to see issues as they pour in. You start to hear people just complain at the water at the water cooler. So it's a little bit different, right? So now we come up with usage recommendations as well that are at least worth paying attention to, even if there's something that you might suppress later. So that's the idea of code quality. Now let's go to code style, because sometimes those get kind of commingled together. And I think that's all right, because a good style certainly contributes to quality, and certainly a bad style can take away from it. So let's think about that for just a second. So we have the idea of naming, which we talked about, how we can identify how things are named based on their semantic scope inside your code. And then we can talk about casing and formatting and things like that. Then we have language styles. Language styles are things like, do you put a space after a parenthesis, right? These are things that will be specific to a language, but there's still a style. Like, do you have two spaces before you put a comment? Things along that line. We also have formatting. Formatting would be other things like how are your indentations kind of handled? Do you require braces around your if statements and things like that? Right. Each one of these are categories that help us determine what our code styles are. We also have a series of rules that identify unnecessary code, which can actually be part of your style. We allow for a variable just to sit there, or we don't allow for a variable to just sit there so we don't have noise in our code. The truth is, the compiler is smarter than most of us, and the compiler will see a lot of the inconsistencies that we add, and the code style barely matters, right? It will take an unused variable and just remove it as it compiles it because it realizes it isn't going to be used. However, that doesn't mean that your code is maintainable as we hand it from one developer to another or work it with each other as a team. Then we have other kind of miscellaneous rules as well that have to do with things like whether or not we can even suppress things. That's an important rule in its own. I know that something should be uppercase, let's just say in a naming convention, but I could suppress that rule. Well, wait a minute. We've got another rule that says you can't suppress that rule. All right, nice. Now we have some checks and balances that allow us to really look at not just code style, but how it contributes then into our own code quality as well. All right, so these terms are important, and we're going to get into those and how they're really managed by something like editor config. All right, so let's talk just a bit about standards. And these are the problems that we need to solve. So the first really is, how do we detect it? How do we detect whether or not you are doing something correctly, right? We don't want to do like a find and replace with text in all your files. That's going to become a real mess for you. And so instead, we want to make things as quick and easy as possible, but we want to make it automated so that we can make it reliable too, so it can't be kind of missed. We also want to make it enforceable. We want to make it so that you can have it inside your IDE, but we also can have it inside our build as well. Yeah, so we can break the build if you're violating some of our quality rules. I like that as well. We want to also make it so that the rules can help the developer, so that the rule will allow for refactoring, but also will also do the refactoring for you as well, not just on the fly, but in a thoughtful way. And then finally, this idea of documentation is really hard. SharePoint just is not enough. You can't put this in a markdown file and consider yourself, done as when it comes to documenting what your standards are. So we need to figure out a way that's both consistent and useful. And the problem is, you have it in SharePoint or some sort of document, then you have it in your IDE as well. And there's always a disconnect because one gets updated and the other doesn't. We need to bring those two things together and figure out a way to build consensus on our team and then share it with each other so that we have a consistency that is across not only the work that we do, but across our team and all the projects that we're on. Okay, so there's a lot of words there, but I love it. I really do. Okay, actually, before we go into managing the code style inside Visual Studio, let me just show you because it's a pretty neat little thing. Let's say that you just joined a project and you open up some existing code and you have something like this. There are three ways that we can address this inside Visual Studio, and there's a lot. And most of these ways have different approaches in different IDEs. So a lot of what I'll show you is already available also in Visual Studio Code for most languages, and you'll see that go on and on, like in Writer and other things as well. And so let's just start like this. So you have a couple developers on your team, and they obviously used to be JavaScript developers because look, they have all of their open brackets right after the type, and they don't have it on a new line. Everybody knows that you're supposed to have it on a new line, but apparently they didn't. How are you going to update this? Well, it's really easy, right? We have code formatting inside Visual Studio. That is, you can do it a couple of ways. A lot of people will go down to, let's see, edit, advanced, and then go up to code format. For me, it's Control ED, which is a keystroke chord that I know in, in my heart. Like I think I do it in my sleep, right on my like wife's shoulder sometimes, right? Control ED, and it will fix these small formatting problems that you've already identified inside Visual Studio. That this is the way you want it. And a lot of these are defaulted. You don't even have to go in and set them. It understands what the basic. We used to call these kind of the MSDN conventions, but now these are the .NET conventions that are documented in Microsoft Docs. You can go in and tweak those if your team is doing it a little bit different. All right, we still have some problems, but at least we don't have our open brackets right after our types on the same line. That's nice, easy enough. All right, so let me show you another problem. Another problem is right here. Well, it turns out, at least in my team, that we require braces in our if statements, right? I know that you can shortcut it like this. You could even shortcut it like this and put it really close or really tight in a single line. And sometimes terse code is really valuable because you're able to reason over it on a single page. However, that's not always enough. The truth of the matter is, we need to have consistency and make it easy so that everything everywhere is the same. So in this case, it's braces. I do Control ED and nothing changes. That's because Control ED is just code formatting. It reformats, but doesn't do anything for the language itself. Here in the language, I can do code cleanup. Code cleanup is pretty nice. I can go down here to my little broom and it'll show me that it's Control KE, or I just can click it. So it's updated this page. That button updates only this page. I can do it at the project or at the solution level as well, which can be awesome and terrifying depending on how you think about it. What's nice is, let me go back. You can see that it's not really an error. You don't see a build error here. You just see that there's a problem. And so then I can clean that up. The third and final thing that we can do, and this is where really all of the power is I can go and I can use this little smart tag over here that drops down a recommendation, right? There's a keystroke for that. I think it's very important that I tell you what that keystroke is. It's Control period. It may be the finest keystroke in all of Visual Studio, and it is. You can just have your cursor anywhere, Control period, and Visual Studio will give you all kinds of not just information but recommendations too. Sometimes you'll be on a line and really there's nothing wrong with it. Control period. You have 5 options to refactor it in a different way, and it can be really, really nice. So it really brings up the analyzers inside C Sharp and gives you an access to whatever the fix might be for those. So I just went to the return that has this little curly bracket here, and I'll say Control period, and it'll say fix the return type. And the return type is a task, but obviously that's not a generic task of string. So if I select that, it changes it to be generic task of string. 3 ways I can update my code. The first way is formatting my code, Control ED. The second way is I can use cleanup, and the final is what we call a code fix, and it's that control period way of getting into it. Pretty powerful, right? All of these have been in different ways available inside Visual Studio, and what it has to do with editor config will make sense here in just a second. All right, so let me jump back to where my slides are, and let's just go quickly into how we tell Visual Studio what it is that we prefer. So I'll go into Tools, Options, and then from there I'll go into Code Style. But honestly, I never do this anymore. The fastest and easiest way to interact with Visual Studio is always by using Control Q and going up into the quick search, typing what you want and letting it find not only options, but the subsection of options. And then when you select it, it'll navigate into that for you so you don't have to find it. I never use the menus like I used to. I'm a keystroke guy, Control Q, and then I type in code style, and boom, you have everything that you need right there. Why it defaults to Visual Basic as the first selection instead of C Sharp? Hey, that's just the way it works. All right, so it pulls up our options. This is what it looks like, just so you can see. I can go in, I can set what my preference is based on whatever the category is. So this is a general set of preferences that you may have that are very language specific, whether or not you want a this in front of all your field accesses, do or don't. And then over at the side, you can set the severity of whether or not it really nags you about it or whether or not it just blows up your application if you don't do it correctly. So that's really nice, a great way to do it. But there's more you can do. You can change things like indentation, right? And so you can solve the entire problem of things like tabs and spaces right here. You can decide whether or not it's open braces on the new line or not, right? Here's where I could set that. It's defaulted to true. A lot of the good and smart settings are just defaulted the way that pretty much everybody does it. That drives a lot of consistency across projects in Visual Studio that you can kind of get for free, to be honest. And one developer and another are both working, and it turns out their code looks kind of the same. The reason is Visual Studio is nudging them in one way or another while still giving them flexibility to come into options and make changes on their own. So I can come in and change naming as well. And so this is probably one of the cooler things that you can do is also you can go in almost everything, well, not almost everything that exists inside C Sharp as far as keywords, modifiers, types, and everything else. You can change and update whatever the naming convention you can have as long as it doesn't break the code itself. So that part is really great. You can decide whatever the casing is. So you can see a couple of them over here with camel case and Pascal case, and you can go in and in fact we have a little editor that allows you to change and decide, like, I could create uppercase snake here if I want to. And so I would create uppercase snake, by the way, because that's the way I do my constants. And so it's very valuable to me. So you can come in and do whatever is special inside your team, your organization, or just something you're really in love with for some reason. And it'll even let you do bad things. So just remember that you can do dumb ideas here and it will enforce them. So be smart. All right. So once I have it, however, now all of a sudden it's valuable. I come in and I try and name, for example, full name my method here with a lowercase f. Again, I feel like I'm a JavaScript developer or something like that, or I just have a typo, or I forgot to do it. No big deal. Or I renamed it maybe from a local method. Nonetheless, it can come in and it'll see here's IDE 106, and it will show me that there's an error. It also shows up in my error list, which is super nice for me. I like it that way. All right, so let's just go over and remind ourselves of these three ways. So the first is around formatting code, Control ED, and it's worth pointing out that Control ED, we call that a keyboard chord, right? Because you can do multiple things, and developers have no problem with this. And I would say every other user on it has a lot of trouble with it because they don't understand. Oh, I have to keep the control down. Yeah, you have to keep the control down, Control E, and then D while you have the control down. And you may have Control KD, right? And it really depends on the settings when you go in. When I go into Visual Studio and it asks what kind of developer I am, I say I am a C# developer. It gives me a whole suite of keyboard settings that are different than if I go in and say I'm a Visual Basic developer or I'm a C++ developer or something along those lines. So depending on what you've selected, it may be a little bit different. You can do what I did, where you go into Editor Advanced and just look at what the keystroke is as well, and figure out what it is for your settings. You can always go in and change your settings as well. All right, so this formatting code is important because we know what it does. We know it changes the formatting, but does nothing with the language and nothing with naming conventions, right? This is valuable because we do it against an entire document or maybe just a section of a document. That's easy enough. So the second was cleanup. So cleanup for me is Control KE, and I think it's true for everybody. It might be different for you, but you'll just have to figure it out. You can mouse over that little broom down at the bottom if you need to. And it does a little bit more, right? It does formatting, which is great. So it is additive. And so these things, so as you go forward, you get to do more. And it also makes changes with the language. So we saw where it added braces to our if statements, which is exactly what we want. And so we have the little broom down here at the bottom. We select that and it gives us a menu. So we don't just push it, but we can also select it. Now, what's nice is cleanup gives us two options. Or sorry, not two options, but two profiles. So we can go into those profiles and say, when I click this button, here's what I want you to do. Don't just do everything because that's just too much for me. And I can go in and I can selectively choose what it is I want it to actually clean up. So I don't want to add braces. I want to manually add braces. Fine. You can do that. Just set your profile to remove that part and it'll go in and do all the other pieces. And so there's a lot it can do. So you get to kind of read through that. All right. Another thing I can do still in code cleanup, I can right click my project and I can run code cleanup. So now it's not running against my individual file, it's running against my entire project and all the files in it. Hopefully you're using source control to do that so you can first see what all your changes are and you can kind of review those and you could go back if there was some sort of mistake. The odds of there being a mistake are actually pretty low because of the sorts of things that it changes are really just tweaking the way your code looks, and it tends to be pretty nice. You can do it against the solution as well, so that's really nice right there in the analyze and code clean up. Speaking of analyze, you could go up to the analyze menu at the top and you can clean up from there as well. 3 ways to do the exact same thing with the exception of scope. So the button is is scope to the document. I can scope to an individual project if I want to. And here in the analyze menu, I run it against the entire solution. So again, hopefully you have source control so you can see what's going on, but the odds of it really causing damage are pretty minimal. But it can make a lot of changes, boy, that's for sure. And it's beautiful. Somebody gives you a code base and you're like, I need to fix this thing. Shazam, it looks so much better, right? It's so nice. Everything gets cleaned up and nice. This is the way it looks, by the way, when I'm editing my profile. I come in and I have all the options there at the bottom. At the top are the only ones that are automatically there. I can have 2 different profiles, not 3, just 2. Why are there not 3? It's just the way it is. Let's not ask too many questions. Okay, so it's a little confusing to me that the profiles go up instead of down. It's not how I would have done it, but once again, let's not ask too many questions. The first and defaulted one is apply header file preference. That is also the first one I remove because um, that is not something that I actually prefer. So that's great. But you can see here it can actually look into your editor config. Let's talk more about the editor config here in just a second. All right, the third and final was code fix. So remember, code fix is control period, absolutely magic. As soon as you click that, you have access to do everything that's possible. And the reason that's there is because we use analyzers, and analyzers have the ability to do code fixes and refactoring. So when I select that, I can see that the code fix, it gives me a preview of what's about to change. And then it also gives me the scope I want to run it in. So this isn't this isn't like code cleanup or anything like that. I can use this to identify an individual problem, fix it right here, fix it in the entire document every time that it happens, the project solution, or just my containing type if I want to do a smaller scope inside the same document. Not same document, of course, if I have a partial class of multiple files, it would work there as well. Pretty neat. Okay. I'm talking fast. I kind of already showed you the demo, right? But let me just no, but I already showed you the demo, so I'm going to move on and just talk about these 3 features, what they have. The most awesome of all is code fix. The most easy of all is code format. You get that when you close a curly brace. You get that when you paste. It just happens automatically, and the keystroke. So you get it all the time. You've probably seen Visual Studio do that for you. So what if you don't like what's going on? So let's go only to code fix, and I can now suppress certain rules. This is going to be important. So now I could go in and I can suppress it, let's say in the source. And as soon as I do, you can see it wrapped my type inside pragma statements. Pragma's sort of interesting, right? The one thing about it is this is unique to the individual type, the individual page that I'm on. So the scope is to a single artifact right here. Now, even better is I get to use Pragma and talk directly to Roslyn, our compiler. And Pragma warning is special because it allows me to disable or maybe even restore different warnings that are there. And so you can kind of see exactly what's going on. I say disable, and I say it's CA, which is code analysis number 1050. Right? And so it turns it off and then turns it right back on. This is handy. It's ugly though, isn't it? Right there in your code. That's nasty. But sometimes you have to do it because you want it to be only in this instance, right? There are certain times that you need to call an async method, synchronously, let's just say, right? The requirement just is there. And so you put it right here. What's great, this is even a type of documentation that allows developers who come in after you maintaining your code or helping to be able to see that this is done on purpose, right? And you can have comments around it as well. I could take the same thing and I can move it out into a global suppressions file. Global suppressions allows me simply to take all of my suppress message statements and put them into something that is no longer scoped to an individual type, but now it's scoped to something to the entire assembly. Right? That's valuable. It's a little frustrating though, and it kind of counteracts what we're going to do in editor config, and you'll see why in here in just a second. A couple of years ago, we introduced .NET Format. .NET Format is pretty nifty. It's the command line tool that allows you basically to point it at a solution or project. And with a command that looks like this, I can update everything inside all of my files. It's basically like right-clicking and saying cleanup, and it will clean up everything under the hood. It allowed me to do certain things as well as far as code fixes, and we'll add more and more. So one nice thing about .NET Format is this is what Visual Studio is using behind the scenes. So there aren't 2 different implementations. There's one implementation and another one is just a GUI implementation. So pretty common way of approaching. It does leave us with the question of how we share all of these preferences, right? We know we have potentially global We have potentially global suppressions. We have it in the file, but we can also have it in our settings. So one of the things you can do is export all of your settings in Visual Studio and have all your developers import your settings. It's a nightmare. Don't do that. This is the worst thing you could ever do, but I've seen developers do it. Don't mess around with your VSS settings file, right? I mean, if that's the only thing you've got, then it's the only thing you've got. But the truth of the matter is there are much better ways. What's the better way? The editor config is the better way. So born in 2011, been around a long time. Editor config was meant to make it so that your experience across different editors is always going to be the same. So your tabs, your spaces, everything like that is going to be the same, right? It's in a simple INI format, not JSON, not XML. It's in an INI format, crazy easy to read, by the way. And the specification itself, and I'll show it to you in just a second, is insanely simple, right? It really has very little to it. And you're like, okay, so what's in editor config? Well, if you're talking about the editor config as the standard across all the IDEs, very little is the answer. Very little is the answer. However, we've supported this inside Visual Studio since 2017, and anymore, the relationship is pretty intimate. That's kind of weird to say, but it is. All right. So let's talk just a little bit about the specification. All right. So this is going to document our standards, right? It takes everything out of settings, out of all these other files, out of as much as we can, and then puts it into a single repository where we can look at a single file that works not only as our documentation, but instructions to the IDE to allow it to actually enforce it for us. It maintains consistency, not just for us across our projects, but also for all of our teams as well, as we share the same file in our project. So this is what one looks like. This is about as simple as it gets. You can see that we can indicate here all files with the star here. So this affects all the files in my folder. Doesn't really think about projects, doesn't think about solutions because it's across all different IDEs. That's the way we would use it inside Visual Studio, yes. But that's not the way it's written. It's just thinking about folders of files. And here you can see we have indent size of 2, but only in our XML file. And of course, you can add CS files, VB files, C++ files, and on it goes, CP files. And look on the right. These are the properties that it actually supports. I told you it was very minimal implementation. Well, it really is. And so here they are, the 8 that are there that it allows right out of the box. How do we get all these other things? Because we extend them. So there are .NET extensions and there are C# extensions. The .NET extensions would be for all the languages of .NET. C# would just be C#, obviously. But the one I want to kind of draw your attention to down here is root. Root is important because root kind of says, oh, these are the tabs, sorry. Root kind of says, if I say root is true in my file, then I don't want to use any other file to override my settings, right? So that's nice because I can have them in file folders, subfolders, subfolders. And I could say at the top level folder, I could say this is for my entire project. And then I can have a subfolder where I have special rules that are just in that folder for whatever reason. And they will inherit from the parent, and then they will apply their special rules that override it in the subfolder unless I put root equals true. So what root equals true, it ignores the parent and isn't overridden. So that's nice, right? So it doesn't inherit all of those other pieces. That's about it. That is the editor config until we extend it for each language and IDE. And so the good news is, by the way, there's tons of support. I mean, there's tons of support. I mean, Dave was joking that he has a love-hate relationship with editor config. I understand that. I kind of do too, to be honest. But that ship has sailed, right? This is it. Everybody uses editor config. So we have a language service inside Visual Studio, but VS Code, we also have full support as well. The language service is how we initially supported the editor config in Visual Studio, but now it's way more embedded than it ever has before. And when you install Visual Studio, you just kind of get it for free. Not all versions of Visual Studio though. So I have the latest version of Visual Studio, which you can get. So if you have 2022 already, then you can go ahead and upgrade to 17.3. I have 73.1. And that's where we get a couple of more kind of pieces of candy when it comes to editor configs. All right, let's look and see what it is we get. So the first thing is to go to options. So if I go into all text editors, there's an option now. I can say follow project coding conventions. What does that mean? Well, I would have written it differently, but I'm kind of a words guy. Instead of follow project coding conventions, I would say let editor config override my local settings. That's what it actually does. So I check that and it says, okay, let's let editor config do its job. By the way, editor config, doing its job. This is checked by default. So you don't have to come in and remember to do this. Didn't Jerry tell me I had to check something? No, I didn't. This is already checked for you, but you can uncheck it if it's driving you crazy, right? That's important too. Now, don't remember, we can move downstream and still enforce all of our code standards. But if it's driving you crazy for whatever reason, you can uncheck it. All right. The other thing I can go in is I can control the way analysis works. So all the analysis that is enabled inside the editor config, I can turn that on or off because it's running in the background. It can be, maybe I'm running on a really lightweight device. So if I'm running on a really lightweight device, I might want to go in and change those and only run them periodically when I know that I want them. That's fine. That's totally fine. So now I right click my project, I say add new item, but instead of saying new item, I go down to the bottom of the menu and we have this new option of adding a new editor config. When we do that, it adds one of two um, templates for us. So if I were to just say file, no, project, add new item, it would give me this dialog. I would filter by editor config and I would see the two options. I would see .NET and I would see default. What's the difference between the two? Well, default is about to be renamed because it's actually a little bit confusing. What it's going to say is .NET or empty. That's right. So .NET it'll have all the configuration that's going to be defaulted based on the team's recommendations for you. Now, this used to be in GitHub. This used to be in Docs. And if you wanted the default editor config, you would go get it from there. Those have been removed. Why? Well, the reason is the number of changes and recommendations, uh, all of the analyzers that we have just keep growing. And those things became out of sync. We needed in one place. So now when we go in and we say add a new editor config, or we select the .NET right here, we get all of the current recommendations right away. So it's beautiful. And if we go into default, it's basically empty, right? Another thing I could do is go into options where I have all of my settings, which I'm actually kind of proud of because for years I've been tweaking these things to code exactly the way I want. And I can click generate an editor config from my settings. So that's really nice too. I can go in and use that as my basis. And so I can do this three ways, right? I could take an empty one, I could take the .NET one, or I could take my own. Or I can kind of munge them together depending on how it is you like to do things. Okay, once I have an editor config, I can start editing that. We have a GUI for that. You go into the GUI, and so now we've broken everything into groups, the white space, the coding styles, all right here. You can see they're separated. It gives us two options, the value, as well as what we do if it's broken. So we can change the severity from disabled, suggestion, warning, and error. Now, when we see these show up as errors, we see IDE. That's the name of the error. So it'd be IDE 1005 or something along those lines. We can even look those up on the internet. They're all explained. There's hundreds of them, and each one is really well thought out. Another thing we can do is come into our project and we can edit it. Make a change that says enforce code style and build. Now all of a sudden somebody violates our coding styles. We make it so they can't build either, right? That's really nice. Now all of a sudden they're not just nagged by the error window, they can't even build until they get it right. That's really good. We have the same naming styles and the same set of conventions that we have anywhere else, right there in the editor. But before we move into analyzers, let's talk about it for just a second. So inside Roslyn, that's our compiler's name. We have a handful of services that allow for analyzers, which can do both code fixes and refactorings. In a lot of ways, code fixes and refactorings are the same thing. Analyzers run against the semantic tree of your code, so it looks and talks to the compiler in the compiler's own language, starts iterating through and figuring out whether or not the scope and usage of different keywords are done in a way that is right for the team, right for your team, right for the library that created this open source library that you're using. Many people can create analyzers. Now, in the past, we actually dealt a little bit with analyzers, and we had FXComp. Do you remember that? So we had FXComp. FXComp is really emerged into what we have now in Visual Studio and what ships with the .NET SDK, and we'll talk about in a second. So FXComp is sort of fading away, and it's going to be replaced by what I'm about to show you. This works inside the IDE, of course. Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code can do all these things, but it also works at the command line, which is what we would want to happen because we're going to use the command line when we do things like our automated pipelines. So if we're in GitHub, for example, we also have the code analysis action that goes ahead and runs code analysis and can determine whether or not there's a pass or fail. This is nice because it's not just failing the build. We can run code analysis and get a nice report on the other side to explain what the blocker is in the pipeline. So this is it, Microsoft.codeanalysis.net analyzers. The team has compiled all of these, migrated from FXCOP and added new ones as we've introduced new syntax and new keywords into C Sharp. So this is the full of it. And with this analyzer, there's three analyzers. This is the mother of them all. And comes in, analyzes your code, and gives you what you need to make your code better. No longer do you need to even add it to your project. It ships with the SDK and it automatically is enabled inside your project by default. So that's great. That should make it so all of us developers out here, we should have a nice baseline that we're all running against to make sure that our code is at least as good as we can, given the way that we're working. All right, so when I go in and I look at my dependency in my project, you can see it lists every single analyzer that's in each of the package. So the first is the C Sharp. You can see here the C Sharp package, right? That's the one specific to C Sharp. And then all the way down here, these are .NET analyzers that are specific to the language or to the framework .NET. And so there, it's much, much longer. And you can see they're all CA something. And the other thing you can see is they indicate what their severity is right here, just so you can see it, right? It's a nice way to be able to just jump in and see what's going on. Not only can you see the severity, you can change the severity right here as well, which is great. I'll make a change like this. It goes into my editor config, which has all of this information that's extended for the language and for the framework, and it allows me to set what that severity is. It updates my editor config for me just by going into Solution Explorer. That's pretty easy and nice, right? It really is. And so it's great. I get to review what those changes are, but I get to make the changes here as well, or I could go in and edit the editor config directly. So if I were to edit the editor config directly, I would just go over to analyzers and I would change whatever its severity is right here. Same effect, right? It changes the editor config on the backside. There are so many that fortunately we've added search so that we can start to find it. So everything that has to do with parameters is what I just searched for here. And you can see where it's collapsed the list so I can find it a little bit easier. Otherwise, you're scrolling through hundreds of analyzers and it's exhausting. I mean, truly it is. Each of those severities, by the way, is different and has different kind of implications. So if I'm inside my Solution Explorer, I can see I have an error. Well, that's nice, but it may or may not break the build depending on whether or not I've set it in my project, right? That's true. And then here's the inside the editor config. If I set it to error, it gives me an error inside my Solution Explorer. The build could fail depending on what it is that I'm setting it. If it's just a code style, I have to explicitly say, let my code styles also break the build. But if it's an analyzer, analyzers will always break the build. And if I set that to an error, it is smart enough that I can trust it, rely on it, and put it into an automated fashion so that I will set its severity to error and I don't have to go in and say, allow it to break the build. It will break the build. Warnings show up like you would expect. But what's nice is the IDE experience. So I have it set to an error. It gives me that red underline we do expect with any exception or any error that you have inside your code. And then warning underlines in green, gray for when it's a suggestion, and then obviously silent doesn't do anything at all. Okay, so the analyzer configuration part is, well, it's pretty valuable, right? It really is. And it's the thing that allows me to say all of these analyzers matter, but these don't. These are the ones that these are the different priorities. And so um, what's beautiful, and you might be asking this in your mind, can I add more analyzers? Well, you can write your own analyzers and they'll show up in your editor config just fine. Or you can download some of the more like popular ones, right? So for sure. StyleCop is still out there, by the way. And what's nice about StyleCop is not style rules. StyleCop are analyzers. It's a family or bucket or container of analyzers. And so it interacts with your code in a slightly different way, looking for the same type of rules, but enforcing them in a more stringent way as well, as because they are analyzers. So that's really nice. StyleCop's still quite popular. And even though all of the style capabilities are still in the IDE or in editor config, honestly, saying break the build when uh, my style settings are violated is pretty close to StyleCop, with the exception of this also has refactoring that allows you to fix it as well. So real lot of neat things there. So that you can do on a document or project or even solution basis. So a lot of power. Roslinator is very popular, so you should take a look. There's like 500 extra analyzers that it gives you, as well as fixes for all of the things in it. If you're using XUnit, which is what I use when I do unit testing, you can use the XUnit analyzer also. And then finally, the Sonar. Sonar Analyzer is very popular, especially inside Microsoft. A lot of developers just really like it, and you'll probably see it on a lot of your projects as well because it is. It's a paid service often, but the analyzers are a little bit different. You can investigate those as well. In a Venn diagram, that against Roslinator, there's an overlap. Is it a lot? Yeah, it is, but you might love it, right? Because of the things that are outside that aren't overlapped. So that's important. I totally get it. All right, so now we have just one thing to remember here, that the reason you would use an editor config is having it in your settings in Visual Studio, having it in SharePoint, having it in your mind, writing a blog about it doesn't really do anything. Not only is it a poor way of communicating, it is a terrible way of enforcing it because it's not actually in any of the tools that are looking at your code. Instead, you want to use something else that brings those two together. That's where editor config comes along. Like it or not, editor config is the most popular way of dealing with this issue in the universe. I don't know, it's the world, the universe. And that's nice, right? All of your standards in one place, including letting those standards be settings that can be enforced inside your IDE. Then we have this idea of analyzers. And analyzers are special, right? They look at your C# code and they analyze it against the compiler semantics, looking at the semantic tree, validating that you're doing things not only properly, the compiler does that for free, but doing them in a way that align to recommendations, that align to your team requirements. And then it can not only find them, but it can also offer some solutions to you as well, giving you the refactoring and code fixes to be able to do that also. So hopefully Control ED, that's what it is for me, is something you type constantly when you're writing your code. And then hopefully you're using cleanup either at a project level. I often do a lot of coding, and then I do a check-in. Not a check-in. That's old TFS words. Then I do what am I doing? I'm a commit. Then I commit the work that I've done. And once I've done a series of commits where I feel like everything's in a good place, I'll do a quick project or solution cleanup, then look to see what I changed. Sometimes it's just a typo, something you know, there's an extra line at the end of a class file or something like that that you just didn't know was there. And it'll clean up a lot of those things for you. And then you can move it on because different areas of your pipeline might actually treat some of these rules differently, right? You can get away with it while you're coding it, but then it goes into your pipeline and it doesn't allow even warnings to pass that treat those as errors as well. So it's kind of up to you. So that's kind of my behavior. And then as I'm on a different line, if it just doesn't look right, I'll just control period it. If it feels like there's something I can do better because of just experience in the past, or if it's underlined in that little gray dot 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 that it gives you, where it has a suggestion to make it better, control dot every time. Control dot is really probably more important than mousing over to the smart tag, selecting that, and opening up the tool, the code tip. And the reason it's better is because honestly, I have trouble mousing over that thing. It just kind of vanishes under my mouse. It's kind of crazy. Okay, those are all the bits. That's everything. So why would you use editor config? How does it fit in? What's its relationship to the tools that you're using? Hopefully all of that makes sense. And then the reason you would use it, the reason you would be attracted to it in the first place is because we care about code quality, is because we care about the things around consistency across our teams. And I always say this to my team, and I always mean it. And it's a great thing. I say it to my students. They think I'm joking, but I'm not. You always have to imagine that the next developer after you, the maintenance developer who will open up your code and look at your code, not only does that developer know what your home address is, they are an axe murderer and you don't want to make them mad because if you ever so we are attentive to our code, making it maintainable, making it beautiful and consistent so that the next developer has a chance. You know what it's like to open up somebody else's code and be so frustrated with the lack of care that they put into it. This gives us a way to not only make our code beautiful, but also follow a lot of the quality rules that we have as well. All right. Thanks for that. Thanks for listening.